Hello everyone and welcome to week 12 of Poll 361. This week we're finally going to learn how to conduct our own data analysis using the computer software program Stata. So this week I'm going to try to provide a really quick tutorial on getting to know Stata. We'll cover topics like how to import your data, understanding the user interface and how the command structure works, and going over data labeling. So setting up your data so it makes sense to you and understanding where your data is, where the commands go, and everything you need to know to get started. And then in the second part of the lecture, we're going to go over some basic analyses that you can use for your research papers. So we'll cover the command structure, some commands for descriptive statistics, and we'll go over some really basic things that are pretty common in Stata, like generating or recoding variables, and then I'll also cover some basics of data visualization. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So for this tutorial, I'm going to be using Stata 16. It's the newest version of Stata, but everything is pretty much the same. You'll notice that when we get into the computer lab on Thursday that I think the computers have Stata 12 or Stata 13, and there's not really a huge difference there. They just, one looks a little bit shinier and new than the older version. So at any rate, when you open up Stata on the computer, this is exactly what you're going to see. We've got our results pane here, which is going to generate all of your results based upon the commands that you type down here in the command box. And then over here is your variable pane. So that's going to show you the name of your variables, as well as any labels that you might have created for that data. But you probably won't have any labels for your data since mostly everyone will be importing an Excel spreadsheet into Stata. So let's just go ahead and get started with how we take our data from Excel and how we put it into Stata. So I've got a spreadsheet here. This, as you will notice, is the common data for research papers that is included in Canvas. So we've got a lot of really helpful demographic variables here. We've got population age 65 and older, we've got percent of the population with a bachelor's degree, median income, and all of this is coded at the state level. So state is the unit of analysis in this mock data set that I have created. So this is what everyone's data set should look like. And what we're going to do is we're simply going to click this little button up here, which is going to select everything in our data set. And we're going to hit Command C or Control C if you're on a Windows, which you will be in the computer lab. We just want to do the hotkey for copying. So I'm going to hit Command C and we're going to copy all of this data. We're going to put this over here, get rid of that for a minute. Click on Stata, and we just want to hit the data editor button. So I know that this looks different on the older versions. Really what you're looking for is the spreadsheet with a little pencil in the corner. So we just click that. And then this is the Excel file, really. This is the spreadsheet that's underneath all of the data that you're going to be analyzing. So we have a command window here, which is where we're going to do our analysis. And then this little box over here is just where our data goes. So we're going to click on this very first cell here. We're going to hit Command V or Control V for paste. Stata is going to ask us if we want to treat the very first row as our variable names. And that is exactly how our data is set up here. The first row is actually the variable name. It's not an observation. So we're going to say, yes, please select those as variable names. And so now we can see that we've got our variable names up here, and all of our data has been seamlessly integrated into Stata. A few things worth noting, in Stata, your variable names cannot begin with a number, so you might get an error code from Stata saying that there were some problems importing your data. You can just rename those variables later. I can show you how to do that. And I think Stata also has some issues if there are spaces in the variable names, but at any rate, this is something that you might want to do before importing your data. Just make sure that it's all one word and that none of the variables have the same name and that none of the variables begin with a number. Otherwise, we're good to jump in and start looking at our data and make sure that it's in the right format for us to start analyzing. So you'll notice this variable here, campus guns, this is the variable from the research paper that we read earlier in the semester about the type of laws that each state has regarding whether or not students and faculty can carry concealed weapons on college campuses or not. Now, one thing that's problematic is that this variable is all in red. This is because this variable is a string variable. Remember, Stata doesn't know how to analyze words. It can only analyze numbers. So the fact that these are all letters, it's coming up in red because Stata is telling us, I'm not going to know what to do with this if you tell me to analyze this with another variable. So hopefully all of your data sets have been revised so they don't include any string variables like this, but if they do, I'm going to show you a really quick trick for converting this string variable into a numerical variable. So we're just going to keep this over here. I like to have the data editor open while I'm also doing my analyses over here in the results pane, but we're just going to pull this up here. And the first command that you're going to learn is Encode. And Encode is going to take your string variables and it's going to automatically turn them into numerical values. The only thing that you have to be careful with is that you have to make sure that there aren't any misspellings here and that they're exactly the same. So, you know, if this colleges decide was missing an S and it said college decide, when I tell Stata to convert all of these distinct categories into the same number, it would interpret college decide and colleges decide as being different. So let me just show you what I mean. So in order to turn that string variable into a numerical variable, all we have to do is tell Stata to encode, and we're going to click over here. This is our campus guns variable, as we can see right here with all of the string observations. We're going to just click this little button over here and it'll populate right here. That way we don't have to worry about typing anything incorrectly. So we're going to say encode campus guns, and then we tell Stata with a comma, please generate this, or we can type gen for short, and then parentheses with our new variable. We'll just call this campus guns 1. And then we close our parentheses, and this is the command structure for turning a string variable into a numerical variable. So we hit enter, and you can see that the new variable just popped up right here at the bottom. Anytime you generate a new variable, it's going to be listed right here at the very bottom. So we can click over here. Here's our original variable, campus guns, and we can scroll all the way over here, and now they're in blue, which is exactly what we want them to do. So these observations that are in blue, this is just telling us that this is a label, and underneath that label is a numerical value. So if we actually click on colleges decide, we can see that now it's a 4 up here. So this is telling us the true value of what's underneath this label. We can click on allowed by law and see that that's a 1. Prohibited by law, we can see that's a 5. So now we have converted this string variable that didn't really make much sense. We've converted this into a numerical variable. So now we can conduct analyses with this. And one very helpful command that you can also use is something called Codebook. And if you have labels on top of your variables, it's going to show you what those numerical qualities are underneath that label. So we can enter Codebook, and then we can click on our new variable over here, click back here, select enter. And now we can see here is the here's the way that this variable is coded. And what the numerical qualities that Stata automatically assigned, how they correspond with a specific label. So we can see that 1 says that campus carry is allowed by law. 2 means campus carry is allowed, but only in locked cars. And then we get all the way to 5, the most restrictive type of law, completely prohibited. So not allowed to carry a concealed weapon on college campuses at all. So this is our new variable. And here's our frequency. So we know that we have 50 states. And so we can see that 7 states fall into category 1, 9 states fall into category 2, 4 states fall into category 3, and so on. So if you have a type of variable like this, or you're coding some type of policy, it's a very good idea to just do this kind of summary statistic. And you can report this in your paper that you analyzed 5 different types of policies, and this is how many states fell into each category. So that's just a very simple, very easy place to begin. If you're introducing a new variable, you're going to want to let the reader know how it's coded and how many states fall into each of those observations. Another really helpful command is tab, or tabulate, and we can type tab for short. And this is, again, just going to show us the frequency distributions for our variable. So let's start with South. Let's say we want to see how many states we have in the South versus the non-South. And you can see here that the way that I've created this variable is that I've just assigned a 1 to each state if they belong to the original Confederacy. So as we know, there are 11 states from the original Confederacy, so I've coded them this way. So 1 means that the state is in the South, 0 means that state is not in the South. But we might, forget what the 0 stands for or what the 1 stands for. So another very helpful command that I want to show you is the label command, which is going to label these values for you, and it's going to create something very similar to what we see here. You're going to see these blue labels on top of what the actual numbers are. So all we have to do is first we have to tell Stata that we want to create a label, and all we type is label define. And so we have to define what the label is going to be called. And I like to just call the label the same thing as the variable. So the label for South, I'm going to call that South. Then we just have to simply tell what we want Stata to call the numbers, the label we want to be associated with each possibility of the observation. So this variable only takes on one of 2 values, that's 0 and 1. So we're going to tell them that we want 0 to be called non-South. So we put those in quotations. And then we have to address the other outcome, which is 1, and we say that we want this to be labeled as South. And you can do this with every variable in your data set. You just have to create a label for every possible outcome. So we have done that here. We hit enter. So we have created the label. Now we want to apply the label to the variable, and that's done very simply. All we say is, please label my values. So here we type in the variable, label the value of South with the label of South. So this is the variable name, this is the label name. Sometimes that can get a little confusing, but as long as you call the label the same name as the variable you want to apply it to, there's really nowhere to go wrong. So then we hit enter, and if we can go back to our data editor, now we see that instead of all these 0s and 1s, we have a nice pretty label to tell us which state belongs to, which region. So this is very helpful for creating graphs and things like that. So when you create a graph in Stata, automatically it's going to give the label in the graph instead of just the number. So this makes things a lot easier. So I really recommend doing this if you've got ordinal variables or dichotomous variables. Go ahead and give them a label in your data set, and it's going to make things a lot easier. We're also going to get rid of this variable just because it's in the way. And just note that when you drop a variable, it is dropped permanently. So I would be very careful with using the drop command. But we're just going to go ahead and get that out of there. We're going to type drop, and we're going to get rid of this variable. So now that it's gone forever, and we're just going to get rid of this 1 here. Say we want to rename this variable. All we have to do is type rename. We're going to click our variable over. So rename this variable something new, and we're just going to call it Campus Guns just like the very original variable, just to get rid of that 1. We hit enter, and the variable has been renamed, and now the 1 is gone from our variable. You can also combine variables in Stata to create brand new variables, which is extraordinarily helpful. In this data set, we have a %Black variable and a %Latino variable. So we go to our data editor and we can see that we've got the % of the population in each state that is Black and the % of the population in each state that is Latino. Now, what's commonly done in political science research is that we add this variable to this variable, and we create a brand new variable that's often called %minority population, which is just a combination of these two variables. And the syntax for Stata to do that is very simple. We simply type gen, which is short for generate, and then the name of the new variable. So we're just going to call it PCT minority for %minority. So we're telling Stata generate this variable that equals, and then we just click over here, our %Black. We're going to put that over here. We're going to do a addition symbol, and it's very simple. We're just telling to Stata to create a new variable by adding these two together. So we hit enter, go back to our data editor just to make sure everything worked out. And here we go. This is our new variable that has combined those two. So really, you can divide variables, you can multiply variables, subtract, whatever you want, just using that very simple syntax here to create new variables. Now, another thing that you might have noticed is that actually our percentage variables are actually proportions, because our decimal spots are all the way over to the left, and they're not really percentages. So you could totally leave it this way. You would just have to remember that instead of the range being, 0 to 100, it's actually 0 to 1. If you're like me and you like everything to be reported in percentages, I'll show you another command that can do really quick mathematical changes to all of your variables. So let's start with this age 65 and older. So this is the % of the population in each state that is 65 years of age or older, and it's currently presented as a proportion. If we wanted to turn this into a percentage, all we have to do is tell Stata to multiply every single value in this variable by 100, and that would move the decimal over 2 spaces to the right. So when we want to do that, we're not really generating a new variable, we're rather replacing the observations. So we type replace space, we put our variable here that we are concerned about, and then we say we want it to equal the same variable, but multiply times 100. We hit enter. We can see that 50 changes have been made. That's good because we have 50 states and 50 observations. We can go back to our data editor to make sure everything worked out. And yes, now every single observation has had the decimal spot moved over twice to the right, and that's exactly what we wanted. And we could actually do this with all of our variables. So I'll show you really quickly how we would kind of do this over and over. One really helpful tip is that if you just hit the page up button on your keyboard, that's going to bring in the last variable in memory. So that gets really helpful when you're doing really repetitive things in Stata. So we hit the page up button, it's here, our last command, and then we can kind of just highlight what we want to get rid of and replace it with new variables.
That's not my business.
So now we've gone through all of our variables, we've multiplied all of our proportions by 100, and now we have percentages for every single variable that was a proportion. You'll notice that I skipped some like housing units or raw population because these are continuous measures that are already in a raw format. These are counts, not percentages, so I skipped those. But now we've got nice, clear, organized data that's all in a ratio format. Another thing that applies to a lot of student papers is that you might have raw counts of a variable that are kind of inherently based upon the population of a state. So for example, I know some students are writing about incarceration rates, and you might have a raw number of people who are incarcerated in a given state. So obviously, the bigger that a state is, the higher the bigger it is, the higher its population. Inherently, the more people you will have who are incarcerated in that state, simply as a function of just being a more populous state. So one thing that we need to do with variables like that are kind of conditional upon the size of the state is we should generally convert those into per capita measurements. In other words, we want to take that raw variable and we want to divide it by the population. So I do have a variable in this data set called housing units. So this is just the raw number of housing units that are available within each state. Obviously, bigger states are going to have more housing units and smaller states are going to have less. So what we want to do is create a new variable that takes this data and it divides it by the population. So we're accounting for the size of each state. And again, we've kind of already done this, and the command is very simple. We're going to generate a new variable. We're going to call this housing 1000 because we're going to make this a variable that's reflective of how many housing units are available per 1,000 residents living in the state. So all we do is we say we're going to generate the new variable, and it's going to equal our original housing variable here, and we're going to divide that by the raw population. We hit enter. And now we've got our new housing variable here. But again, it's in a proportion. So if we really wanted to understand how many housing units were available per 1,000 residents, all we have to do is multiply each of these values by 1,000. So that's quite simple. All we do is say we replace housing 1,000, and we're going to multiply it times 1,000. That way we have a rate per 1,000 residents. We hit enter. Oops. Make sure you add everything there. We click back over to our variable, and here we go. So now we see how many housing units are available per 1,000 residents in every single state. So I just wanted to make sure to go over that process of how to make a per capita measurement or a per 1,000 residents measurement. You could do 10,000, you could do 100,000. It really just depends on the size of the variable and what makes most sense. So that is how you create those type of variables. The very final thing that I want to show you is how to create labels in Stata so you can quickly look at the variables in your data set and you can remember how they're measured or what they mean. So for example, we can pull this window over here to make things a little bit easier to see. Pull this label over here. This %BA, we might forget what exactly this means, but I created the data, so I know that this is the % of the population in each state with a bachelor's degree or higher. So all we have to do, let's move this over here. We click this little lock to unlock, which is going to allow us to make all kinds of changes to the way that the variables are displayed in Stata. And we're just going to click on this little label here. This is different than the observation labels that we created, the values labels. This is a variable label. So we can just type in here what exactly this variable stands for. Once we have our description typed out, we can just hit enter. And now we've got a really nice little label here to look at all of our data, and we can see, okay, this stands for this. Are there any others that might be a little confusing? I mean, we could click on this one and we could say that this is You can type whatever you want in this label pane. This is just for you to quickly look at your variables over here and remind yourself of what it measures and how it's coded.